Perfect. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Chúk Odenigbo, and I'm so honored and pleased to be in front of you virtually today. First of all, welcome to Oceans Week Halifax. Bienvenue à la Semaine des Océans de Halifax. I know for a lot of you, for myself included, I've never been able to attend Ocean Week Halifax in person because it's always been in Halifax. But due to the adaptations we've been doing for COVID-19, for the COVID-19 virus pandemic, it allows us to be able to be pan-Canadian, and that's really, really exciting, and I'm just really honored to be in front of you today. So aujourd'hui, la présentation se déroulera en anglais. Cependant, mes diapositives sont bilingues et je suis ouverte aux questions en français. So today I'll mostly be presenting in English. If I do switch languages, the slides are bilingual, so feel free to read to follow along. The comment section will be monitored for questions, so that way when we get to the question period, the questions will be captured and answered en français ou en anglais. And yeah, we are all ocean people. Nous sommes toutes océaniques. We're going to be chatting about what this means, why this is important, and how sort of Canadian identity is incorporated into the oceans, and the oceans are incorporated into who we are as Canadians. So d'abord, je vais commencer en parlant un peu de moi, like who is this random person in front of you today. So once again, my name is Chúk Odenigbo. I am one of the directors of Ancestral Services at Future Ancestor Services. My title in French is super fancy because I got to make it, and I like a long, fancy title. So en français, c'est le responsable supérieur d'éducation des services à l'ancêtre. I am Franco-Albertan. I'm originally from Calgary. I'm currently living in the Ottawa-Gatineau area. And I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa in medical geography. My research looks at the health impacts of place in order to inform policy. So I'm constantly looking at the ways in which space, place, and human health interact. And I'll be touching upon that in this presentation as we look at how the oceans impact human health as well. As Mo mentioned, I was part of the 2018-2019 Ocean Bridge cohort, the inaugural cohort. So Ocean Bridge is a program that brings together 40 youth from across the country to do what they can to empower them really to impact ocean literacy, impact ocean health, and impact ocean knowledge and understanding in Canada, essentially making us all ocean activists and ocean advocates. So to start off with, as we begin this presentation, let's take a moment to recognize the history of the land that we are on. So, faisant une reconnaissance d'appartenance de la Terre, je vais utiliser le mot de Negan Sinclair. C'est une analyse fondamentale de qui nous sommes, d'où nous nous trouvons et de comment nous devrions procéder. C'est une manière fondamentale de vraiment reconnaître notre responsabilité envers cette terre, ses gardiens et ses habitants. Donc, on essaie de s'identifier, on essaie de mettre en place qui nous sommes par rapport à la terre, par rapport à la terre sur laquelle on se trouve. So just switching to English, if you aren't immediately asking questions upon your arrival of your ancestors on the land you are on, and about your role, history, and relationship to that land, then there needs to be some questions asked about how we perpetrate contemporary colonial erasure and violence. So by not doing a language acknowledgement, we are ignoring the history of the land. And as a result, we are ignoring our responsibility to the land, and not just to the land, but to the people who were able to take care of this land before we arrived, and to the people who will be inheriting this land after we leave, and to the people we share the land with. So a land acknowledgement is just a very sort of important way to take that time to reflect on our identity and what our identity means in the context of where we are and what that translates to in terms of our responsibility. So although we are taking precautionary measures in having this event online, I wanted to tailor my land acknowledgement to Halifax, Nova Scotia, to acknowledge where many of you are and where this event was first crafted and conceptualized. Remember that a land acknowledgement is a manner of understanding the history of the land on which we find ourselves and our connection with it, and thus our responsibility to it. I encourage you to use this moment to reflect on your identity and the land on which you're on. Make your acknowledgement personal to you. As a Black French Canadian living in Canada, I'd like to pay respect to the Mi'kmaq people who have lived for thousands of years in Mi'kmaqui, part of which is now known as Nova Scotia, Canada. It is due to their stewardship and love for the land that Nova Scotia has been able to become home to so many peoples who came after. The Mi'kmaq people have and continue to demand climate justice, sovereignty, and the right to live. It is imperative that we take our direction from these peoples and the knowledge systems, teachings, and cultures that inherently center the earth and her well-being. I would also like to pay respect to all the Indigenous people from across all nations in Canada who call Mi'kmaqui home, whether they be young or old, as they too continue to seek climate justice and the right to live with dignity and self-respect in following the cultural teachings and systems. I would like to also recognize the history of slavery and indentured servitude in Canada and pay respect to all the Black and non-Black peoples whose blood went into building this nation. Specific to Nova Scotia, I want to acknowledge the Black Nova Scotians who fought segregation and legalized racism, and in doing so, brought rights and dignities to Black people across Canada, and who continue to this day to fight for the right to exist, right to live, and right to clean water. As many of you are aware, it has been a tough 2 weeks for Black people. It is very disgruntling to wake up every day and see images of people that look like you and that look like members of your family being killed, and having those deaths be debated and discussed. It is exhausting to have your rights be the flavor of the week, all the while scared that this too shall pass and that the energy that has been accumulated and the trauma that has been experienced will all be for naught. I hope each and every one of you on this call has been extra kind to your Black friends, co-workers, acquaintances this week, as our right to exist without additional scrutiny and violence has been repeatedly questioned and attacked. I'd like to pay respect to the Acadian people who are forcibly expelled from these lands after having settled for generations and sent to unknown territories only to come back and face extreme levels of sociolinguistic discrimination, see the erasure of their history and the assimilation of their peoples. Je vous rends hommage. And finally, to all of the immigrants that fell in love with Mi'kmaqui and gave this land their offspring, their legacies, and their lives, thank you. Immigrants to Canada, to Nova Scotia, have had to fight through layers of discrimination and racism, yet have loved this land with all of their hearts and have contributed to their home and to the home of their future generations with love and with respect. And so, as we pay these respects to the various peoples who have made up Nova Scotia, and as you are paying your personal respects to the people who made up the land on which you find yourself, I think this transitions nicely into the concept of we are ocean people. Nous sommes océaniques. So let's talk about what Canadian identity is in relation to the ocean. How are we ocean people? What does this mean? So the basics, à la base. Our national motto is Amari usque ad marem, d'une océan à l'autre, from sea to sea. I think there's also an argument to try and make it from sea to sea to sea to be more inclusive of the north. But essentially, we have defined our country in terms of the borders with the water body, with the ocean. Canada is the only country in the world whose unified territory touches 3 oceans, the Pacific, the Arctic, and the Atlantic. That is to say, there is no other country on this earth whose unified territory, because the countries who have like separate territories, but whose unified territory touches 3 oceans. And what that effectively means is we are as close to being ocean people as we can be without being an island nation. Yet we are a nation that has a lot of island people. So just in terms of how we have structured ourselves, how we have set ourselves up, how the symbols, the way we look at ourselves, we already have the ocean fully integrated and in mind. Just in terms of access to water, on average, Canada's rivers drain nearly 9% of the world's renewable water sources, while we only have 1% of the world's population. For many of us, we are so inundated with renewable water sources that we take water for granted. That's who we are as a country. We're so blessed water-wise. We're so blessed in terms of the oceans that we often forget how much they are integrated into our daily lives. So if we start looking at the cultures across what is now known as Canada, let's start with indigenous nations. So indigenous people in Canada have very strong sort of identity and cultural ties to nature and to the land. And these ties are very much reflected in when we look at the ocean as well. So taking a couple of examples, the Haida in British Columbia, in northern British Columbia, have 52 different words to describe waves in the ocean. And the origin story talks about them being birthed from the ocean. They always say people came from the ocean, and when we are done on this earth, to the ocean we will go. So to them, the ocean is just a crucial, important, integral aspect to identity, and is a part of who they are. It's a part of the origin story. The Inuit in the north, their entire traditional diet is heavily centered around oceanic animals, whales, narwhal, seal, um, which effectively means that the only reason they're able to function and survive the way that they have and thrive the way they have up north is because of the incredible abundance that the ocean has been able to gift to them, and that reciprocal relationship they formed with the ocean and taking care of it to really sort of integrate into that oceanic ecosystem. And then as a fun side fact, the canoe design in Canada largely comes from Inuit ingenuity. That is an Inuit design. And then going into internal Canada. So these are peoples who don't have territories that border directly an ocean. We're looking at like Ojibwe oral history and how they believe they originate from the mouth of the St. Lawrence River on the Atlantic coast of what is now known as Quebec. And so they once again see themselves as water people. They see their origin as coming from the water, coming from the ocean, even if the ocean is at a distance. And then even taking into account the Métis people, because we've talked about First Nations, we've talked about Inuit, but what about the Métis? So the Métis communities formed along the waterways of Canada because they formed as the Europeans, especially the French Canadians, sort of followed fur trading routes, followed the waterways. They would meet indigenous communities, and in those intersections, we found Métis communities start growing. And Métis communities formed because they were rejected by the settler community, they were rejected by the colonizers, and they were also rejected by their indigenous counterparts. So they had to form their own independent communities, and these communities formed around these waterways because that is how their identity came to be. So when we look at indigenous nations, the various nations across Canada, there's so many ties to the ocean inherent in the origin story, inherent in practices, inherent in language, that the ocean is already such a powerful element of identity. And then switching to the culture franco-canadian, French-Canadian culture. Those of you who are French-Canadian will have heard of l'histoire de la chasse-galerie. And for those of you who haven't, it is called the story of the flying canoe. And so this is the idea of, this is a story of loggers in Gatineau. So Gatineau is right by the Rideau River, sorry, the Rideau Canal. And this story talks about how these loggers were in the middle of nowhere logging as loggers do, and they really missed their wives, and they made a pact with the devil in order to steal a boat so they could visit their woman. And that is sort of that French Canadian mentality of if you want to be transported, if you want transportation, automatically you go to a boat. That is the first idea that comes to mind. It's not a horse. They weren't given a flying horse. They weren't given a sled. It was a canoe. It was a boat. As a random side note, there was a movie made in Quebec about this. It's really interesting, and it has English subtitles. I really encourage all of you to watch it. Then, as many of you from Nova Scotia know, the Acadian flag. Many of you from New Brunswick or the East in general will know the Acadian flag. It looks like the French tricolor, but there is a star in one of the corners. So this star is actually called Our Lady, Star of the Sea. It's an ancient title for the Virgin Mary, and it's dedicated to Mary being a guiding star for seafarers. And it's mainly used, sort of this depiction of Mary is mainly used in Catholic coastal and fishing communities. And so it just kind of highlights that the Acadian peoples see themselves as sea peoples. They mostly built their communities, their villages, and now their cities alongside the coast of the ocean in New Brunswick and in Nova Scotia. And they've often had very heavy economic ties to the ocean, being fishermen, being seafarers. That is their identity as being seafarers. The irony, of course, being also because of Le Grand Dérangement, when they were expelled from these lands by the British. It created this really interesting inverse relationship with the ocean, where the ocean is both a reminder of a very atrocious history, but also an identity marker. Then we have Les Voyageurs. So Les Voyageurs is a name that was given to the French Canadians who did fur trading back when Canada was still forming, or back when Canada was still being colonized. And these fur traders became very, very adept at navigating the waterways and traveling by canoe. They essentially became water peoples or ocean peoples. And they established communities as far as Alberta, Northwest Territories, British Columbia, and the Yukon that exist to this day and maintain strong ties to the sea. So a lot of history, when you look at the history of Franco-Colombian, Francophones from BC, the history of Franco-Albertain, Francophones from Alberta, Franco-Ténois, Francophones from Northwest Territories, a Franco-Yukonais, Francophones from the Yukon, you see these strong ties to the ocean because a lot of these ancestry is linked to oceanfarers. And so as Francophones from these areas, we owe our culture and our language to the oceans because the oceans and being ocean people allowed the first Francophones to come to these areas and thus give us our language. Even those of us who are immigrants, we were able to come to an existing Francophone culture because of this. And then let's hop into mainstream Canadian culture. So fun fact, Canada is the only country in the world that was mapped by canoe. That's very cool. We were mapped by canoe. Who else was mapped by canoe? And there's two types of canoes. So there's the open propelled by a single blade paddle, known internationally as the Canadian or the sea boat. And then there's the double blade paddle known as the kayak or the K boat. So the kayak or the K boat is the one that was very strongly influenced by Inuit ingenuity and Inuit culture. And so that needs a little bit of that recognition as well. But what I think is very interesting is that internationally, people look at a canoe and they think Canada. That is how oceanfaring we are, that people look at a canoe and think Canada, or it's called a Canadian boat or the sea boat. Even economically, the ocean is very important to who we are as a country. So fish and seafood are among Canada's largest food exports. And in 2016, that was a $6.6 billion revenue stream for our country. So the oceans are incredibly important just to every facet, just our identity, but also our like our cultural identity, but also our economic identity. I also highlight here the fishermen and women of Newfoundland and sort of the cod fishery. How when the cod fishery went down, it wasn't just a need for an economic change. That wasn't the issue. The real issue was the social and cultural identity. Like being a cod fisherman wasn't just here's how I make my money. It was a way of life. It was an identity. It was a source of pride. It was like, this is who I am. This is who my grandfather was. This is who my great-grandfather was. So you have all of these identity aspects so that even if today the cod fishery is mostly non-existent in Newfoundland, people still identify with it because it's not just a job. It was an identity. And to kind of take this inland, because I think sometimes when you talk about being ocean people, we're thinking, oh, BC, Nova Scotia, the Atlantic provinces, what about Alberta? What about Saskatchewan? What about Manitoba? So I wanted to use an example from Alberta. Those of you from Alberta have definitely heard of the Chinook. So the Chinook is a moist wind that blows from the Pacific and makes the Albertan winter milder. And so it's a large part of how Albertans experience winter because it makes winter very bearable. So it's like in Alberta, it'll be minus 30 one day. And then the Chinook winds will blow in casually about once, twice-ish a month. Will blow in casually and all of a sudden it's +5, +10 for that day, for that week. And so you see people out and about taking advantage of nature, taking advantage of being in the outdoors. And you get there's so many health benefits that come from just being physically in nature. There's that spiritual benefit of feeling connected to the earth. There's the psychological benefit of sort of nature distressing human beings. There's just the positive emotional impact of feeling alive and feeling happiness on being outdoors. And so the Chinook allows Albertans to truly be able to enjoy their winter, which comes from the oceans, which comes from the Pacific Ocean. which makes Albertans ocean people, because without that Chinook, without that connection to the ocean, what would Alberta be today? Will Alberta be as popular? Will Albertans be as outdoorsy as they currently are? You know, a lot of our identity, a lot of our culture is formed around the oceans. We don't even realize that link, because sometimes the link isn't as direct as being able to go fish because you live on the coast of Newfoundland. So I wanted to sort of end this little section with this quote that I thought was very powerful. The wealth and biodiversity of Canada's oceans hold enormous potential for present and future generations. The oceans have given our ancestors so much. Whether your ancestors are Indigenous or settlers, or you are the first generation, the oceans have given so much that have allowed Canada to flourish the way it has, so that even if you are first generation Canadian and your parents are the ones who arrived, or you are the one who arrived, the ocean has allowed Canada to be what it is, to allow you to enjoy this land. And so we need to take care of those oceans so that our future generations of Canadians, whether these are birthed from us or whether these are future generations who are arriving on our shores, also continue to love and adore and take the benefit from Canada. So with all of that in mind, I wanted to do a quick switch so that we can focus a little bit on how the ocean impacts human health and why they are both very strongly related. Because I think sometimes we expect people to be selfless when it comes to the ocean. And I think people are allowed to be selfish. But I think in demonstrating why ocean health is so crucial to human health, it allows people to be selfish and thinking, I want to do this for my own health, and that benefits directly the ocean. So let's start with the basics. What is ocean health? The California Initiative to define ocean health defines a healthy ocean or healthy ocean ecosystems as well as exhibiting normal form and function. And I wanted to emphasize that normal does not necessarily mean pristine. I think a lot of times in the environmental movement, we have a habit of almost idealizing pristine nature, like nature that hasn't been touched by human beings. And by doing that, we often forget that we as human beings are a part of nature, and nature impacts who we are, and we impact nature. And so while a lot of times human activities do have negative impacts on nature, there are many, many human activities that have a positive impact on nature. And so in enabling and encouraging people to reconnect to the environment and reconnect with nature and become one with nature, see themselves as part of nature or see themselves as part of the ocean, we start protecting the ocean because people start seeing it as protecting a part of who they are and a part of themselves. So the Ocean Health Index was crafted by some very interesting sort of independent scientists and thinkers. And it really centers around an ecosystem that integrates both humanity and the oceans as one sort of system where if you hurt one, you're hurting the other. So we talk about how when evaluating how healthy an ocean is, we're looking at how are we looking at food provision? Is the ocean able to provide food to both the people that need that food and to the animals in the ocean that also need that food and to the plants in the ocean? Like, is the ocean providing food? Is the ocean able to feed people? Is the ocean able to feed animals? Is the ocean able to feed plants? We're looking at artisanal fishing opportunities. So these are, small, like I'm going to go out fishing, I'm going to catch 10 fish. These are not the industrial fishing activities we're talking about when we talk about artisanal fishing opportunities. In French, we call that pêche vivière. So like the idea of like living off of fishing. Is the ocean able to provide natural products? And so when we say natural products, we're talking about medicines. We're talking about the ocean provides so much more than just food, right? It provides shelter. It provides a lot of very interesting things that we use. It provides kelp, which can be used as a medicine, but can also be used to make a tent if you're trapped on a desert island. I mean, it does so many very interesting things. As many of you who work in climate change know, the ocean is, a carbon store. It absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. So when we're evaluating how healthy an ocean is, we're asking ourselves, is it still able to absorb carbon? Are we still getting that sort of net carbon reduction from this ocean? We talk about coastal protection. So how the ocean impacts coastal communities and whether or not it is hurting them or protecting them. We talk about tourism and recreation. So now we're looking at the economy, because one of the things that protects nature is nature that makes money. And the ocean, it's really interesting to see how all of these things are linked, because in tourism and recreation, more women work in tourism and recreation than men. So at that point, we're looking at protecting women. We're looking at feminism. We're looking at giving women autonomy by having a thriving tourism and recreation industry, which comes from having a healthy, beautiful, clean, pristine ocean. And when I say pristine, I'm meaning normal. I don't mean untouched by humanity. But we're looking at, if the ocean is healthy, that means women in a coastal community are healthy. We're looking at coastal livelihoods. We're looking at economies. Once again, we're also looking at sense of place. So that's what I talked about for the last 10, 20 minutes is really sort of that sense of place, that identity. Are the human beings able to identify with the ocean? Because once you identify with the ocean, once the ocean is a part of who you are and your identity, then at that moment you're also more likely protected. But then also the inverse is true. If the ocean is harmed, you feel harmed. You feel like a family member is harmed. You are hurt as well. So it creates a very interesting symbiotic relationship. And then, of course, clean water and biodiversity are also other measures of ocean health. So when discussing health, of course, the other thing we need to talk about is public health. What is public health? So according to the WHO, public health is the art and science of preventing disease, prolonging life, and promoting health through the organized efforts of society. So public health essentially focuses on the entire spectrum of health. Public health is not just the absence of disease. That is not enough, because we recognize that health is a scale, right? Like just because you don't have a disease doesn't mean you're healthy. And when we talk about health, we talk about good health, we talk about bad health. So it's sort of recognizing that health is on a sliding scale, and what is good health for someone might be bad health for someone else, right? That's also one of the factors that have to be taken into consideration. So public health focuses on the entire spectrum of health and well-being, and it is multidisciplinary and is normally broken down into 4 pillars. We have the physical, the mental, emotional, and spiritual. So let me break this down for you definition-wise. When we talk about physical health, that's, I think, what most people understand when they understand health. So we're talking about diseases. We're talking about COVID. We're talking about broken bones. We're just talking about diseases in general, or something you can measure, something that's tangible. If you have a physical health issue, normally that's when you're looking to see a doctor, you're looking to see a dermatologist, you're looking to see some sort of practitioner. When you talk about mental and emotional health, and I have to talk about the two together, it's like talking about the weather and the climate. The weather is daily, right? It can be a very hot day today, record-breaking temperatures, and then a very cold day tomorrow. But then the climate can be changing at a radical rate, in sort of the grand scheme of things. So emotional health is your day-to-day. You can be depressed for an hour, you can be happy for another hour, you can be, sad. Emotional health is just very much, what are your emotions in the moment? And normally when you're having emotional health crises, that's when you start talking to friends, you talk to family, you talk to people who are close to you, you have those discussions, you go out into nature, all that fun stuff. But mental health is the long term. Mental health is, you've been depressed for months at a time. Even if during those months you've had peaks of happiness, it as an overall thing, you have been depressed or you've been hurt. You've been unable to fully cope with the daily stresses of your life. And that's when you need to see, a therapist. You're looking at seeing a psychologist. You may be looking at seeing a psychiatrist, depending on what the issue is specifically. And then spiritual health is the most difficult to define because it is the most individualistic of all these sort of 4 pillars. And so spiritual health essentially talks about how, like, the purpose we see ourselves having on this earth, or feeling like we have a purpose on this earth. It is actually not linked to religion. So there's many people who are very religious who have very poor spiritual health, and many people who are fully atheists who have good spiritual health. Spiritual health essentially is nourishing your purpose, your raison d'être, the reason why you feel like you are on this earth. And so a lot of people find that being out in nature, being by the oceans, being in the sea, allows them to recharge spiritually. But there are also many other ways of doing this. It really is very sort of individual. And so the WHO listed the following as the main public health challenges in the 21st century: economic crisis, widening inequalities, an aging population, increasing levels of chronic disease, migration and urbanization, and I highlighted this one because I wanted to like this to be the point, environmental damage and climate change. The World Health Organization, the worldwide authority on health and public health, is saying that if you damage the environment and climate change, those are impacting human health. And so in recognizing that the ocean's health, that a good, healthy, strong ocean is critical to a good, healthy, strong human population, I think that allows people to, even if they're acting selfishly, fight for the oceans, because they're saying if the oceans get hurt, I will be hurt. If I'm not directly hurt, my kids will be hurt. Someone's going to be hurt. So let's talk a quick bit about how this pain comes into form. So, Alabas, the basics. Here's how the ocean impacts human health. It supplies fresh water. Most of the rain comes from the ocean. It supplies nearly all of the Earth's oxygen, which is funny because a lot of people talk about the Amazon being the Earth's lungs, but they don't provide nearly, a quarter of the amount of oxygen that the oceans provide. That being said, the Amazon is important. This is not to dismiss the Amazon, but just to say, I think a lot of times we forget that the ocean is what allows us to really breathe. It moderates climate. As I mentioned, the Chinook in Alberta, it really sort of allows people to be able to have a good, safe place to live. And we in Canada, once again, are very blessed by the oceans. It influences weather. It provides food and medicines. So as I mentioned, sort of those natural components that we're able to get from the sea and get from the oceans. Coastal regions are susceptible to natural hazards. So we're talking tsunamis, hurricanes, cyclones, sea level change, and storm surges. I wanted to include this because I think sometimes when we have these discussions, we tend to romanticize the ocean. But the ocean also is dangerous. And we just need to also keep that in mind, that it is Mother Nature. And while Mother Nature does a lot of good for us, she can also hurt us in the same blow. And lastly, the ocean influences multiple cultural bonds. And these cultural bonds are essential for good mental, emotional, and spiritual health. While they may not particularly influence the physical health directly, your culture, your culture en lien avec les océans, in line with the oceans, really helps sort of shape the way in which you cope with the daily stresses of life, and you cope with struggles, and you cope with difficulty. And a lot of people have integrated the ocean into how they cope. And so in harming the ocean, we harm the ability to cope. But in having a good, beautiful ocean that's there for us, we also support these people in their ability to cope. But let's dive a little bit deeper. There's this really great book by, I have totally forgotten the author, but I put down the name of the book in the slide. It's called Blue Mind, The Surprising Science That Shows How Being Near, In, or Underwater can make you healthier, happier, and more connected. And one of the key quotes that I think really struck me when I read this book is, we are beginning to learn that our brains are hardwired to react positively to water, and that being near it can calm and connect us, increase innovation and insight, and even heal what's broken. I think to a large extent I'm preaching to the choir when I say I'm imagining that many of you who are on this call do connect with the oceans. But for those of you who are inland and don't have an ocean to connect with, how many times have you looked at the fountain and just felt at peace just watching that water flow? This is what we mean when we say blue spaces are important to who we are, and our brains are hardwired to react positively to these blue spaces. So diving in deeper into some really interesting science, and these are from peer-reviewed articles. Seeing the ocean can induce creativity in humans through spatial distance. So the idea is when human beings look at the ocean, we don't see limits, right? Like the ocean just spreads forever. We don't see where it ends. We don't see the sides. We're just literally looking at this vast, massive expansion. And apparently what that does is in the human brain, we respond visually to things, right? So we see something that has no limits. And so we start taking the limits off of our creativity, and that induces an increased level of creativity in human beings. Increased views of blue space is significantly associated with lower levels of psychological distress. So once again, going back to that whole, we feel calmer when we see water flowing. We feel calmer when we hear water. How many of you sleep by putting on the sound of rain falling or the sound of a creek doing the bubbling? Water calms us. It gives us a sense of like, ooh, a sense of, ooh, don't know how to say that in English. The ocean invokes feelings of awe, which has been proven to be linked to greater levels of societal belonging and empathy. So because the ocean is so vast and wide, when people see the ocean, especially for the first time, a lot of time the reaction is awe. They're like, whoa, like they're choqués, like c'est admiration, c'est stupeur. It's like, oh my God. And so what this does is it makes us feel insignificant. It reminds us of our own humanity, our own fragility, our own smallness. And this smallness pushes us to form stronger links with our society, with our community. And that's why ocean communities tend to have much stronger bonds than non-oceanic communities. And interesting enough, we kind of see this across Canada, right? Like how many times has a disaster happened and Canadians have rallied together? How many times have, when Alberta was burning down, everyone and their cousin donated and they were hosting homes for like all the Fort McMurray people. When there were fires in northern BC, when there was flooding in Ottawa-Gatineau, when there's flooding in Montreal, like people came together, people wanted time, people wanted hours. They were like, you are my neighbor, we are a community, we are Canadians. And that comes from that feeling of being small, of being insignificant and needing to have that support from the people around you. And so it's seen a lot more in ocean communities, but we see the ripple effect across the countries because people are like, why isn't New Brunswickers so close to each other? We should be close to each other too. Let's up our game. Let's be stronger. People who live in coastal regions are shown to be healthier and to live longer than those who do not. The reasons are multiple, better diets. They tend to be more outdoorsy. When you live next to the ocean, you are going to do more walks on the beach. You are going to be outdoors a lot more often to take advantage of that. And more physical activity. So there's many different reasons and many different layers as to this. And there's also the social component, right? Because if you feel like you can trust your community, that's less anxiety, that's less stress on you. That less stress leads to a longer life. And then there's sort of the cultural and emotional links to the ocean that can provoke greater health consequences in the event of environmental degradation. So I touched upon this earlier, but essentially the only downside really of identifying with the ocean is when you see the ocean being hurt, it hurts you too. And this hurt is not stemming from lack of access to clean water or something like that. We've got very ingenious systems as human beings where we've been able to filter everything left, right, and center. So even if we polluted all of the oceans in the world, theoretically, we should still be able to get clean water for everyone. But when the ocean is a part of your identity, when it is like a family member to you, like an ancestor to you, like when the ocean is a part of who you are, when you see the ocean hurt, you feel hurt. It is like when you see your grandparents dealing with old age and you see someone fall down, it hurts you. It hurts your soul. You are just in pain for that person. It makes you depressed. It gives you emotional issues. It affects your spirituality. It affects your raison d'être. You're like, why am I on this earth if there's nothing beautiful? Why is life worth living? And so we see this especially in indigenous communities, because a lot of indigenous communities, as I mentioned earlier, have very, very direct, strong cultural links with the oceans, where they see themselves as ocean people and they see themselves as part of the ocean. And so a lot of times when they fight against ocean pollution, it's not because they're worried about clean water. For some, there very much is issues about clean water, but it's also because it's who they are. It's their identity. It's their ancestry. It's their land. It's a spiritual thing. There's just so much in there. There's so much to unpack in there. So just sort of when we talk about the oceans, when we fight for the oceans, there's so much great science that we can chat about, and we can talk about acidification, we can talk about fisheries and lack of access to seafood, but then we also need to talk about how much it hurts to see a member of our family being so incredibly disrespected when she has given us so much. And so with that, let's chat a bit about ocean inclusivity. Like, what does an ocean advocate look like? So to start this up, I wanted to share what I'd call more of a theoretical concept, but that I think is very, very true and very necessary and needs to be more mainstreamed. So a French geographer named Henri Lefebvre came up with this concept of the triplicity of space, which essentially believes that all spaces, all places, are more than just a physical space, but they're divided into 3 dimensions. And everyone lives different dimensions. And that makes it really interesting to sort of understand the space. So every place is more than just a physical space. It's an amalgamation of the physical, social, and symbolic factors inherent to the intersection between the individual and the space. So the triplicity of space forces us to acknowledge our positionality, forces us to acknowledge our ancestry, our identity, our future. It really forces us to acknowledge who we are. So it's divided into 3. We've got espace perçu. So this is the physical characteristics of the space. So giving you this example, let's say I'm in a coastal community, in a small rural town in Nova Scotia coastal community. Mon espace perçu is the same for everyone. We all see the same space. We all see the beach, we all see the ocean, we all see the small community, we all see the buildings that are available, we all see sort of the services that are available, we all see the same thing. So espace perçu is often what we're talking about when we talk about a place. We are normally talking about this espace perçu. Then there is espace conçu. So these are the sociocultural characteristics of a place. So in being in a small town, we think, oh, because you're in a small town, there's less to do, but there's better food. There is, people are friendlier, it's more close-knit. These are your espace conçu. These are sociocultural characteristics of the place. Maybe the place is francophone because there's a lot of small fishermen towns in Nova Scotia that are francophone. Maybe it is not. Maybe people are educated. Maybe people are not. But that's like your espace conçu. Then your espace vécu is its symbolic importance and meaning of a place. So this is when your history and your background really comes to influence a place for you. Espace conçu and espace vécu, it's really interesting because, so when we're talking about a small town, mon espace vécu as a Black man in Canada, I'll be concerned because in small coastal communities, they haven't necessarily been introduced to diversity. So will they be racist? Will they treat me badly? Will they treat me differently? Will I be outcasted? That's mon espace vécu, right? The symbolic meaning of what a small town is in Canada to a non-white person. But in mon espace conçu is what actually happens, right? It's a sociocultural characteristics of the place. Maybe they're really friendly and they are wonderful and warm and welcoming to me. Or maybe they are horribly racist. So that's all about the sociocultural determinants of that place. And so I think in recognizing that everyone sees a space in 3 dimensions. And so often when I see disagreements are happening because one person is talking about an espace perçu and the other person is talking about an espace vécu, right? Like when people of color, when BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous people of color, women are talking about not feeling safe in a place, for example. It's very easy for a man to be like, but there's so much lighting. I've been by this place, nothing's ever happened to me. That's your espace perçu. You see the lighting, sure. Like maybe we're talking about a park at night. There's lots of street lamps. You see the lighting, you're like, it's safe. I see the lighting. I've walked by here many times, I've never seen another person. But then that espace vécu. As a woman, you're like, walking alone at night in this park, in this neighborhood, that doesn't feel safe. I, as a woman, I don't think that's okay. Then there's espace conçu. Is this a community that has a lot of feminist characteristics? Is this a community that respects women? Or is this a community that doesn't respect women? So I think when we chat about ocean advocacy, when we chat about the oceans, when we're trying to talk to people who are different from us and people who are not us, we need to understand that everyone has these 3 dimensions. And while we may all have the same espace perçu, sometimes when someone's talking about a place, they're talking about the espace vécu, sometimes talking about the espace conçu, and we need to be able to switch dimensions to understand and experience what it is they're experiencing and what they're seeing. So now, with that in mind, let's talk about intersectionality. So the concept of intersectionality has been defined as an intersectional oppression that arises out of the combination of various oppressions, which together produce something unique and distinct from any one form of discrimination standing alone. So to give an example, if you are a woman, you experience discrimination as a woman. If you are a Black woman, you experience discrimination as a Black person, and as a woman, and as a Black woman. And then if you're a Black queer woman, you experience discrimination as a Black person. You experience discrimination as a woman. You experience discrimination as a Black woman. You experience discrimination as a queer person. You experience discrimination as a queer woman. You experience discrimination as a queer Black woman. And these are all unique. So essentially, when we talk about intersectionality, it takes into account the historical, social, and political context in which the person lives in. So we're looking at the history to know whether it's racism or prejudice. We're looking at the socio-political context. What do the people live like today? What are the politicians like? What are they saying? In Canada, we have this really bad habit of saying, okay, I know he's not great socially, but economically he could do this, or he has more experience in this. And so sometimes we tend to excuse someone's negative potential social impacts or in decision making because they may have, a background in economics. That's normally the main reason I always see, at least. We need to recognize the unique experience of the individual. So we need to recognize that, like, intersectionality comes with so many different unique forms, right? It's like you can be a white person who is socioeconomically disenfranchised. So what does that mean? It means you get white privilege, but it also means that you are treated negatively by society because of your economic status and you are poor. And then you can get a Black socioeconomically disenfranchised person who is treated badly because he's Black, treated badly because he's socioeconomically disenfranchised, and treated badly because he's a socioeconomically disenfranchised Black person, right? So it recognizes that that person has a unique experience that is unique to them, and then also that they may have common experiences that are unique to Black people and that are unique to socioeconomically disenfranchised people. And so knowing sort of which experiences we're talking about. And so through using intersectional lens, we're able to sort of target that particular experience of discrimination based on the confluence of grounds involved and seek to acknowledge that it's real, not dismiss the person, and then remedy that situation. And I think that's something we do a lot more in the environmental movement, because we have a habit of saying, oh, we're talking about the ocean, let's not talk about indigenous identity in relation to the ocean. Let's just focus on the ocean. And that misses a lot when we say things like that. So I wanted to give you guys a couple of examples of how when the oceans are harmed, what intersectional identity does. So when the oceans are harmed, women are more impacted than men. I have a couple of examples. There's many, many more. So one of the ways is the feminization of the sea and nature. So in French, in English, in most languages, nature and anything to do with nature are given women pronouns. The sea and the ocean are often said in sort of like in female terms. And so what we found, or what many scientists have found, social scientists and social scientists and natural science scientists, have found that societies that value women more and that value the autonomy of women value nature more just for being nature, whereas societies that are more sexist have a habit of only valuing nature for what it's able to give to humanity, right? So only valuing nature for its ecosystemic services, but not valuing nature because it exists and it deserves to exist and it deserves to be treated with respect. So there's that component. If the oceans are being harmed, most likely the society that's harming the ocean does not see women as valuable or does not see women as being equal to men. More women work in minimum wage jobs than men, at least in Canada, but honestly around the world as well. And so the oceans provide a lot of minimum wage jobs. They provide a lot of jobs in the tourism industry. They provide a lot of jobs in very sort of like niche industries that do pay minimum wage, and women tend to take up the bulk of these jobs. And so by harming the ocean, it prevents from these jobs from existing, which harms the autonomy of these women. and the economic strength of this woman, or economic contribution of these women. And then other communities, as we mentioned, are coastal communities. All of the communities depend heavily on the ocean for their existence and their way of life. And in these communities, a lot of men work in the oceans. And so when the ocean is harmed, that leads to economic downturn in these communities, and economic downturn has been demonstrated to have a link to increased domestic violence in the household. And so when the oceans are harmed, more women are being hurt at home by their loved ones. Indigenous people are more impacted than non-Indigenous people. So we're talking about food security, for example. Many Indigenous communities are very heavily reliant on the ocean for a traditional diet, but not even just a traditional diet. Even, for example, the Inuit, now that they have access to southern foods at a higher price point, but they have access to southern foods, it's still not good for their health. So there's also that sort of health component as well, and the food desert component. Indigenous communities who rely heavily on the oceans for their meals, for their food, for food accessibility, are heavily impacted when the oceans are harmed because they no longer have access to that food. And so they're either paying a premium to get food to get westernized food from larger urban centers, or they are eating contaminated food and getting higher levels of mercury poisoning, as we saw in Saskatchewan, for example. And then sort of going back to those psychosocial impacts of ocean pollution, as we mentioned before. And then let's talk about intersectionality as well. What about Indigenous women? So Indigenous women are being harmed by the feminization, being harmed more than men, and then they're also being harmed as Indigenous people, and then they're being harmed in a unique way as Indigenous women. So once again, we're just seeing all those intersections playing out. Black Nova Scotians are more impacted than white Nova Scotians. So that's when we're talking about environmental racism. Ellen Page recently released a documentary on Netflix about access to clean water and environmental racism in Nova Scotia specifically. But then we're also talking about the historical and actual relationship with the sea for Black people. And I'm going to touch upon this a little bit later, but Black people in North America who've been here for generations have a very twisted relationship with the sea because many of them have been intergenerationally traumatized by the sea. So essentially, when all these slave ships were coming, all of Black people were drowned, starved, died, committed suicide before they arrived in the Americas. And so what that leads to is many people in the Caribbean, even if these are island countries, cannot swim. And many Black people in Nova Scotia cannot swim because there's this automatic rejection of the sea. There's this rejection of the water. There's this fear, and the fear is intergenerational. Like they did this really fascinating experiment where they showed how like most babies, when you put them in water, when they're first born, automatically know how to swim. But Black babies just have like this automatic like, ugh, reaction when it comes to the water because that fear of the water has just been integrated into our DNA to the point where it's now intergenerational. And I say Black, I'm talking about like Black in North America, not necessarily like Black in Africa, where that intergenerational trauma took place on land rather than through the sea. And then, Francophones are more impacted than Anglophones, right? So Francophone communities in Canada have a greater economic reliance on the ocean than the Anglophone communities, which means that if the ocean is harmed, they struggle more in recovering economically. Because the other thing that happens is when Francophones leave their communities to go to major cities in Canada, they're forced to speak English. They have to have a good level of English to be able to make it in the workplace, and that's just discriminatory. And then the other aspect is when you think about ocean knowledge, when you think about all the ocean conferences you have attended, think about all the ocean events that you have attended in a bilingual country. How many times has that event been bilingual? How many times has the knowledge produced at that event been shared in both languages? And so essentially what's happening is English communities are advancing in the understanding of the ocean. They're advancing in the understanding of their responsibility to the ocean and the relationship with the ocean. And French communities aren't advancing at that same rate because the knowledge is just not being translated. It's not being produced in French. And even though many Francophones are bilingual, culturally speaking, they're going to read French media. They're going to hang out with their French friends. And so at what point is the English information going to hit them? So, and then once again, taking it back to intersectionality, What about a Francophone woman? What impacts does she have, right? What about a Black Nova Scotian woman? What about a Indigenous Black Nova Scotian woman? Because, people mix. We now have Afro-Indigenous people who are very prominent in our communities. What happens to them? What kind of dangers are they facing when the oceans are harmed? So when I think about intersectionality, I want you guys to think about identity, because we can't just do the whole one size fits all. Harming the ocean harms everyone the same way. That's not true. Harming the ocean harms people in very different ways. So case study, this was shared with me by Mo, and I found out that this was happening in Nova Scotia, and I thought this was one of the coolest things ever. So Nova Scotia has the largest and oldest Indigenous African Nova Scotian community in Canada, and yet, as I mentioned before, most of these people cannot swim. Most of these people have no relationship with the water. And so the Northwestern Surf Program is a surf program that had 30 youth of African descent in Nova Scotia, and they taught them swimming, they taught them surfing, and they were just really focused on changing that relationship Black people have with the oceans, changing that intergenerational trauma so that it's not passed on to the next generation, giving Black people positive experiences with the water. I mean, that's so exciting. I smiled when I saw this because that's so beautiful. Can you imagine changing the way someone feels about the water and making someone feel more at home in the land that they've been on for over 200 years? Can you imagine making someone feel more like Nova Scotia is their place because they are no longer scared of the sea? That's powerful. And that's beautiful. And that is what intersectionality in ocean advocacy does. It takes into account people's different histories and then tries to enable and empower people to reconnect to the ocean and find their way of protecting it. Because these Black people who participate in this program, they will fight for the ocean. They're no longer scared of it. It is now part of who they are. They will fight for it. And that's really important. I wanted to share a quote by one of the people who participate in this program. I grew up being aware of the barriers that Black people had swimming, going to the beach, and being involved in anything having to do with water. Our history of being removed from Africa or in slave ships. This is by Evan White. And she goes on to talk about how even her mother, who grew up in the Caribbean, still to this day does not know how to swim. This is powerful stuff. So when you talk about the oceans, when you talk about being an ocean advocate, I wanted to highlight a couple of exclusionary behaviors. This is not a full list. There's many, many more. But I wanted to highlight some of the behaviors that I've often seen that have often, turned off people I know. So these are both personal experiences and experiences I've heard from other people. Number one is individualizing societal issues. So this actually very much annoys me. When we talk about individual and societal issues, we're talking about, for example, if a mother of four, single mother of four, working 3 jobs to make ends meet, runs to the grocery store, she's not thinking about the environment. She's not thinking about anything except getting food for her kids, and she grabs a plastic bag. There are a lot of people that will vilify her and will be like, the turtles are dying because of you. And that's not true. That is absolutely not true. 50% of the pollution, of ocean pollution that we see is a result of industrial fishing. 50%. And a very small percentage actually comes from people throwing things into the ocean. So when we individualize societal issues, what we're saying is we as a society function this way, and as individuals, we need to take certain steps to be good to the ocean. And not everyone has the same access to those steps. For example, I today am wearing a shirt that says Canadian Certain. It's by Province of Canada. It is made in Canada by Canadian designers. This shirt was $45, excluding tax and shipping. $45. I'm not going to go and hate on someone who bought a $5 shirt from Walmart because that was more accessible to them, that was cheaper for them, and that was what their budget has, even though that comes with a large economic footprint, that comes with ethical issues of potential slave labor, and that comes with clothes that have polyester sewn into it to be able to give you that cheapness so that it increases microplastics in the ocean. I wouldn't vilify them because the system we are in, the society we are in, allows for companies to even offer such options to people, right? So when you individual societal issue, you are forgetting that everyone has different espace perçu, espace vécu, espace aperçu. You don't know the history, you don't know the intersectionality. And so it's important to support people in finding their own way of connection with the oceans, because when someone finds their own individual way of connecting the oceans, they will find their own way to give back to the oceans. Placing ocean science above the lived experience of ocean peoples. So as a scientist, I love science. Many of us love science. Science is a very rigorous process, right? It's like you have a theory, you have to, try an experiment, you try another experiment. You have your peers who try and, look for the pitfalls, look for the gaps, look for the issues. And it's a rigorous process. When a scientist says, I'm certain of this, it's a fact. But the thing is, ocean peoples, indigenous peoples, people who've lived next to the ocean for generations, have had generations to run these same experiments. And so when you're looking at traditional chronological knowledge, when you're looking at old wives' tales, when you're looking at testimonies of people who were born, raised, lived their entire lives by the ocean, we should not dismiss that for science. Because if something's not proven in science, that doesn't mean it's not true. And so we need to learn that these are equal knowledge systems and equal ways of producing knowledge. And we need to understand that as ocean people, they have so much knowledge to give, and that yes, we can do scientific experiments to confirm what they're saying is correct and whatnot. But it's important to take it at face value and be like, if this has been your experience, and if this has been your grandmother's experience, if this has been your great grandmother's experience, then it's probably true. And acknowledge that those experiences are very much valid, and that form of knowledge is very much valid. Then, there's trying to create a distinction between social justice issues and oceanic health. Even while Mo and I were in Haida Gwaii in northern British Columbia learning about ocean literacy and putting in place community programs to improve ocean health literacy and awareness across Canada, I faced direct racism from people in Haida Gwaii. You cannot create a distinction between social justice issues and oceanic health, because a lot of times one of the reasons why people are not putting in their energy into fighting for the environment is because they're fighting for their lives. For someone to know that they need to use their strength to fight for the oceans, they need to know that they don't have to fight for themselves as well, right? Like a lot of times when we see environmental movements in Canada, they're very, very white. And the reason they're very, very white isn't because non-white people don't care. It's not because POC don't care. It's not because Black people don't care. It's not because Indigenous people don't care. It's because we have other priorities, right? We are busy trying to fight to stay alive. We are fighting for clean drinking water in certain communities. We are fighting for this host of issues. And so we don't have time to dedicate to the oceans. And that's unfair to us, and it's unfair to the oceans. And so in recognizing that social justice and oceanic health are very deeply integrated, you can do a lot more. Then releasing reports and statements in English only. Once again, bilingual country. If you produce knowledge in English only, you're skipping out a good 20 to 30% of the country. And that's unfortunate. And then whenever you can, try and produce information in indigenous language too. I know a lot of times it is difficulty finding capacity, there's difficulty finding translators, but it's important that we start producing knowledge in the various languages that are inherent to Canada, because in doing so, we reach a lot more people, we reach a larger audience, and we also say, we care about you, and that you are invited to the table, and we want to hear what you think, and we think you are important. These invisible welcome signs are necessary for us to advance as a nation, for us to advance as a people, for us to advance as neighbors. And then the last thing I wanted to highlight is not acknowledging who is at the table when you make decisions. Sometimes it's hard to be inclusive of everyone, right? Sometimes when you make decisions, we know that not everyone is at the table, but you need to acknowledge who isn't at the table when you're making those decisions and who is, because that acknowledges the groups that the identities that you're able to reflect in the work that you're trying to produce. And so by acknowledging who isn't at the table, sometimes you can say to yourself, okay, we don't have any disabled people during this conversation. let's touch base with communities and groups that work with disabled people to try and get their perspective. But if you don't have that capacity, even if you still have to produce your event without having the capacity, at least it's you're aware that there's a certain group of people that you're unable to reach or that you haven't had that discussion with in what you're doing. And so you're aware of where the exclusionary aspect of what you're trying to do is, so that as you move forward, as you progress, as you grow as an ocean advocate, as you grow as an ocean scientist, as you grow as an ocean activist, you're constantly being more and more inclusive each time. So that comes to the end of my presentation. I want to leave you with 3 takeaways, 3 bite-sized pieces that you can memorize, that you can use, that you can share, in hopes that this makes it really easy to sort of retain the points. Because I gave you like a lot of information, but I want to break it down for you. So, number 1, love the ocean. It is part of who we are. As Canadians, we are an ocean country. We're an ocean people. We're an ocean country. We're the only country in the world whose unified territory touches 3 oceans. That is powerful. Our motto is Mari Usk ad Marem. That is powerful. All the indigenous cultures value the oceans. Every immigrant has had to cross an ocean to get here. Somewhere in each of our histories and ancestries, there's an ocean story. We are an ocean people. Number 2, be inclusive. Accept that others may love the ocean differently. Every time you do something for the oceans, for ocean literacy, for ocean health, ask yourself, who are you excluding? Who cannot attend this event or take part in this social movement? Why? Can you include them? Always ask yourself those questions. Even if you can't include them, that's fine, but at least you need to know what's going on. You need to be aware, be self-aware at all moments in time. Like I know we're doing this event, for example, anyone who lives in a rural community that has shady internet cannot participate. We're aware of that, but we don't have the capacity to do otherwise, right? So always be aware of who you're excluding in what you're doing. And number 3, learn. Accept that there are multiple systems of knowledge production and sharing. Be open to traditional technological knowledge. Be open to lived experiences. Be open to the impacts of space and place. Be open to listen to other people's espace aperçu, other people's espace vécu, and grow. Thank you. I'll pass it on to Larissa.
Please welcome our silent clapping and excitement at the information that has been shared. You were so articulate, and if you just peruse through the comments, a lot of people were really engaged throughout the entirety of this presentation. Now, we did have one question come up during the presentation, and this is a point of clarification. So the question is, just to clarify, women are affected when the ocean is harmed because the ocean provides humans with minimum wage jobs that women typically have. And if the oceans are harmed, women don't have those jobs. So Teresa just wants to clarify that. And Chúk, I will send this to you in our chat that you may respond.
Okay, I can't see anything except my screen just because of the way Zoom works. But yes, so in Canada, a lot of minimum wage jobs. We've also seen this with COVID, right? More women are impacted in COVID than men. So according to if you look at statistics in who gets COVID in Canada, more women are getting COVID than men, even though more men are dying. And so what that effectively is showing is that women, more women are working in minimum wage jobs. So more women work as a cashier, in cashier roles. More women work in épicerie. How do you say épicerie in English? Grocery stores. Oh my God, there we go. More women work in grocery stores. More women work as nurses. More women work in healthcare. So women tend to take on a lot of the minimum wage jobs in society. And this is for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's just part-time work because they want to focus on having a family, and their family is structured in a little bit more of the stereotypical traditional way where the man has a full-time job and the woman takes care of the kids, but they need a little bit of extra income. Sometimes it takes on the whole access to employment. It takes on sometimes societal pressures on women. There's a wage gap issue. So a lot of times when we look at minimum wage jobs, we're looking at women, and the ocean provides a lot of minimum wage jobs on the coasts. A lot of times when you are on the coast in BC, on the coast in Nova Scotia, when you're looking at the food vendors, a lot of times they're women. A lot of times when you go into tourist offices and you want to have, you want to ask questions for information, a lot of times they're women. Even a lot of sort of marine biologists or marine scientists are women. That role attracts a lot of women. So when we look at the jobs that the ocean produces, a lot of women are very much heavily implicated economically in these oceans. So yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Chúk. We do have one other question. In terms of access to references and resources, so Chúk will actually be sending all of you an email, all of those who are registered, an email following this presentation with the recording of this presentation, and then also with a photo of the graphic recording, and any other further links, including the presentation slides. So please expect to see those resources over the next few days as we get that content ready for you. So I'll pass on speaking to Mo, as it doesn't look like there are any other questions. So there you go, Mo.
Hello. Thank you, Larissa and Chúk. Oh my gosh. I don't know what to say. That you were able to share all of this knowledge and expertise with everyone here. And there was about 90 people who stayed on and engaged the whole time. And so thank you so much to everyone who took the time to attend this talk and share it with your friends and take notes and comment. And thank you so much, Chúk and Larissa. This is an amazing collaboration, and looking forward to working with you again, and hopefully lots more to come.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I guess I'll finish off on one last comment. I just want to, this is the last thing I want to share with everyone as you guys leave for the rest of your days and as you move forward in your work. This is one of my favorite quotes from Mère Teresa. Nous réalisons que ce que nous accomplissons n'est qu'une goutte dans l'océan. Mais si cette goutte n'existait pas dans l'océan, elle manquerait. So a quick English translation. We realize that what we are doing is only one drop in the ocean. But if this drop did not exist in the ocean, she would miss it. So I hope this gives you some encouragement as you go forth and make Canada a better place for the ocean.